Let's talk a little bit about the cultural biases or sort of the the way in which culture can influence what's defined as a mental illness and what's not. I think recently of the explosion in awareness and therefore medication of ADHD, and I suppose ADHD would be classified as a mental illness, right? Technically, yes. So it's interesting to me that that's a cultural phenomenon, right? To describe, in another era or in another culture, a person that we say has quote unquote ADHD would just be described as having a particular personality, like introversion or extroversion. And likewise, you could imagine the culture changing to a point where introversion is described as a mental illness, or too much extroversion is described as a mental illness. So how do you think about the way in which culture shapes our definitions of mental illness?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely it does. And this is, of course, one of the controversies about psychiatry and about the DSM specifically, for instance, is, to what extent do these categories we talk about reflect real illnesses, if you will. I try to put like air quotes around the word real, as opposed to these kinds of cultural perceptions of people that are desirable or undesirable or whatever else. And the reality is that, mental health conditions don't exactly exist in the same way that like the flu or COVID-19 or cancer does. That for a lot of medical conditions, there's a blood test, there's an MRI, there's some kind of test you can take, and you clearly have it. And if you have influenza, if you have the flu, you have the flu whether you're in the United States, you have the flu whether you're in Japan. Doesn't matter where you are, it's the same flu. Doesn't matter what point in history you are, it's still the flu. It just doesn't change, in the sort of cultural context. Whereas mental illnesses, there's an element of that. That's not to say there isn't some kind of like biological reality behind many mental illnesses. That psychosis is still psychosis, whatever culture or time period you happen to be in. But there is this kind of like judgment call about where the boundaries of these mental illnesses are. And of course, probably the most famous example is the situation of homosexuality, which was a diagnosable mental health condition for decades until gradually society decided that this was not, something that was problematic. So in this sense, the perceptions of mental illness sometimes can relate to, morality to some extent. People that are behaving in ways that we find undesirable, that we judge them to be ill, and thus can use that to stigmatize them, put them away in psychiatric facility, whatever you want to do with them, try to change them with some kind of therapy, conversion therapy for some homosexuality, for instance. And there are definitely these cultural kind of judgment calls about whether something really is a mental illness or not. And there are a lot of controversies right now about the DSM-5, but one of them, of course, in my area is whether there is a such thing as a gaming disorder. Is it possible that people can overdo gaming, to the extent that it can be a mental illness? Well, of course, we're also at the point where a lot of people, particularly older people, don't like video games. So is it that this is a real mental disorder, or is it just old people complaining about video games and finding some sort of way to institutionalize that? And that's where there's a lot of debate. Why do we care about video game addiction and not all the other things that people overdo, which don't have a diagnosis, for them?
Yeah, I recently got into an argument with a friend over whether playing video games all day was the same as playing chess all day. My instinct was, I don't see how it's so different in principle, in that they're both addictive in the sense that you want to do them all the time. You can do them all the time now with online chess. And this person really had a strong intuition that there's something fundamentally different about playing Call of Duty all day, because chess maybe has this allure of having to be a genius to be good at it, but to me, it's just they're both games at the end of the day. And my sense was it's not so different. And the stigma surrounding video games from people who don't totally understand it. And I would frankly count myself as one of those people. It's it's been 10 or 15 years since I really cared or enjoyed video games. But I can see how being outside of the world, there's just so much you don't understand about it, and it's if you're not a proverbial 15-year-old boy and you're worried about your son playing too much, it just all seems pathological, where other addictions seem totally healthy.